Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation and introduction to plant identification. It is an introduction. We're not going to spend an hour together and then go out into the world and know what every single plant out there is. But what we hope to achieve today is the basics. Make sure you actually want to pursue the practice of plant identification. My name is James Stevenson. I'm with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences right here in Pinellas County. Please use the Q&A feature in your toolbar this afternoon. You can add questions throughout the presentation today, and at various times along the way, we'll take a break, take a sip of water, answer some questions, and mostly we'll save them for the end. So hopefully you'll stick around to the end. We've got quite a few people today, and hopefully we'll have some good questions, and hopefully the presentation will answer those without having to add them into the Q&A. We'll save the chat box feature for Julia to add some important links and information along the way. So that's all the housekeeping I really have. We might as well jump into it. Today we're going to look at the basics of plant identification, and we're going to do it like this. We're going to identify some major groups of plants. Then we'll look at some of the characteristics that we need as wannabe plant identifiers to focus on and become aware of and weigh what's important and what isn't. And we'll finish up briefly with some available tools and resources. Everyone kind of has their own preferences when it comes to what kind of references, methods that you like to use. So I always like when we embark on a plant identification excursion to try and figure out why identify plants. Why did you sign up today? What was the impetus? We know that a lot of people are interested in the topic. We had quite a few people show up, but why? Answers to these questions usually fall within this range. Want to know what's poisonous? Could a plant be harmful? Because we are aware that certain plants have defenses that can harm us. Some people are particularly interested in plants that have a value for one particular group of insects, the butterflies, of all the groups of insects. Some people want to correctly identify a plant that is within their realm of influence, a yard or some other property, determining if it's native, if it's not native, if it's potentially invasive. Some people want to know what they're putting in their landscape. A lot of people want to know if it's edible, and that comes with quite a lot. Some people just want to know the names of the plants in their garden so that if they do decide to do further research for whatever reason, they have the correct name applied to that plant. So there's all kinds of reasons, but really, really, really what I think it boils down to is we have an innate curiosity, and we like to satisfy the what is that sense that we have as human beings. And even when I was a much younger human being, I had that innate questioning about what is it? What is that? I'm particularly drawn to plants. We have the distinct pleasure of having the photographer who took this picture of me back in, I think, 1969, 68, something like that. And that person is also ultimately responsible for today's presentation, my own mama. Plant identification is a discipline. It's not something that, well, it's a discipline, and it's something that you have to want to do. Just like playing the guitar or any other musical instrument is a discipline, what we're doing today is we're going to become familiar with the instrument and how to hold it, how to approach the subject, get a taste for the vocabulary that is aligned with this discipline, just like playing a musical instrument, and underscore that plant identification, being a discipline, requires an awful lot of what? Practice. This isn't something that you can sit for an hour and then go do forever. This is something that needs practice. You have to want to do it. You have to be interested enough in it to practice and continue with your practice and build on what you continue to learn until you get to the point where you're comfortable knowing just enough. And knowing just enough is just fine. So when we're talking about the world of plants, and if you can look out the window and you will see plants, I guarantee. Looking out the window, somewhere in your vista, you will see plants. Well, there's about 400,000 different plants out there that have been described so far. Of course, we're losing a few species every day. We're learning about new species every day and so on. But generally speaking, there's about 400,000 out there. And it would be tedious, if not impossible, to show a slideshow of 400,000 plants with their names at the bottom and expect anyone to learn anything that way. So that's not the approach that we're going to take. We're going to categorize plants. We're going to put them into discrete little bundles, just like we always have. We have given groups of plants particular names that have a particular meaning to us. And here are a few traditional classifications of plants. We could consider the trees. We could consider weeds as a, economically important subset of the plant world. Vegetables, another economically important subset of all the plants that we know of. Invasives could make a list. The flowers that you plant in your garden and all these things. But these classifications are subjective. These are not scientific classifications. And the study of plant identification is a discipline that is based on science. So instead of being subjective, because obviously one person's weed could very easily be another person's vegetable, what I'm going to show you is the groups that scientists around the world agree upon. And those groups include just 4. Now, there's more than 4, there's here and there, but basically, for our intents and purposes, in the introduction to plant identification, there are only 4 kinds of plants out there. There are the mosses, which are almost very easily overlooked. They represent the first of the land plants, hadn't quite got their, well, no, they had completely got their act together for living on land. They produce no roots, they produce no leaves, but they do produce waterproof structures that can photosynthesize outside of the water, live on land, not dry out, and go through their life cycle completely on land. Those are the mosses. They're tiny, they're small. They can't get very tall because they don't have any plumbing. They don't have any of the tissues that can move all that sugar photosynthate throughout their body parts. Moving along in complexity, and as plants became more and more adapted to life on land, the ferns came into being. And the ferns do have roots, and they do have stems, and they do have leaves. They have that plumbing that allows their photosynthate to get around in the body and to become larger plants. Mosses and ferns both reproduce by spores, which is a very basic form of plant reproduction. Fast forward in a couple million years as plants continue to adapt to life on land, and we end up with a group of plants, group number 3, which are the gymnosperms, and these are probably best known as the conifers. They have vascular tissue, roots and stems and leaves. A lot of times the leaves are needles. And they reproduce by seeds. And seeds represent a big jump, a big bonus to life on land, leaving a lot less to chance. You don't have to produce quite as many seeds as you do spores in order to reproduce an individual and bring the population into stability. But these plants produce these reproductive structures called cones, and their seeds are naked. Their seeds are just released out into the world on their own. Good luck. Fast forward another couple million years, and the development, the appearance of the flowering plants. And the flowering plants kind of came around the same time that insects were getting their insect acts together. And the two groups of organisms, one group of animals, the other group of plants, became very intricately entwined. And we have the flowering plants depending on insects, the insects depending on flowering plants, both groups becoming amazingly diverse. And the flowering plants are the majority of what you see out there. So think about it. Look out your window. Is that plant that you see a moss? Is it a tiny little thing with no vascular tissue reproducing by spores? No. Is it a fern reproducing by spores and having not particular great height? Is it a conifer? Does it produce a cone and needles like a pine tree? If it's none of those things, it is a flowering plant. So there we have a major breakdown of the four big groups of plants. The majority of the plants that most humans are concerned with identifying are only the three: ferns, conifers or gymnosperms, and the flowering plants. It takes a very, very special person to study the mosses, and I'm glad they exist, and I'm not it. What we're going to focus on today is the largest group, the flowering plants, because it's the most of what's out there. It's generally speaking what most people are interested in identifying. It takes arguably the most amount of work because it is the largest of the group. If you look closely at this slide, you can see there are only 35 families of ferns with about 10,000 species. And out of 400,000 plants, you can see that's just a little slice. The gymnosperms, the conifers, only 14 families with 1,000 species. So again, if gymnosperms is something that you want to identify or work with, you have a very limited pool to study. And you've already decided that your specimen is not any of these others. You can focus on that one smaller group. But today we're going to drill down into the flowering plants with their 400 families and 300,000 species. Now, I said family. Yes, plants are categorized into families, just like we have those nice big four scientific breakdowns: mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and flowering plants. Flowering plants and all these others themselves are then broken down into smaller groups called families. That might not be unfamiliar. It might be something that you may have heard of before. Families. You already know some plant families. I am sure that you already do. And I'm going to use a little bit, going to take a little bit of, just be a little bit cagey with an example that I'm about to show you. What helps immensely in plant identification is being able to walk up to a specimen and recognize who its people are, who its family is, what family it might be in. Recognizing what puts a particular plant in a particular group is a long step, a big step towards proper identification. Because at the end of the day, properly identifying one thing in your hand as an unknown is eliminating all the things that it isn't. So our unknown specimen that isn't a moss, a fern, a gymnosperm, is a flowering plant. Then we can start eliminating among the flowering plants all the things that it isn't. Here's kind of what I'm getting at. Here we have a group of animals, living organisms, multicellular, just like our plants. This is a group called the Felidae. And in the Felidae, this group, which are known as the cats, we have different kinds, different genera, different species, but they're all cats. We have the jaguar, the panther, the cheetah, the tiger, the lion, and Mildred. I'm sure you can see the familial resemblance among these organisms. And so if you had an unknown specimen, you could recognize the familial characteristics that put your unknown specimen into that bigger group called the Felidae. So you could study that one group, eliminating all the other animals in the world, just study this one group until you get an identification for your unknown, which in this case is the snow leopard. Do you get that? What makes a cat a cat? Well, we can see what makes a cat a cat. It comes down to how that animal is put together. And that's called morphology. How something is put together is its own morphology. And the group of placental mammals that we call the cats, and that constitutes a scientific group of placental mammals, they have a common ancestor that they all radiated from, and they're all put together the same way. Now, they're different sizes with different colors, and they occupy different ecological niches on different continents, which makes them different species, but basically they're put together the same way. A cat skull of one species has the same construction as a cat skull of another species. Plants are just the same, only it's much easier and less painful or challenging to take plants apart as it is to take things like cats apart, which is how we can study plant morphology a little bit more easily. Here we have a scientific group of plants, flowering plants, that are in a nice, discrete scientific subset of the flowering plants. And this is a family of plants within the Asteraceae. And A-C-E-A-E, that's a suffix that is assigned to indicate that what we're talking about is a family of plants. And the Asteraceae includes sunflowers, all the different sunflowers, daisies and all the different daisies, the tick seeds, the gerberas or gerberas, or however you want to say it, bidens. Some of you might even know the scientific name for beggar's ticks is bidens, and blanket flower or gaillardia. These are all in the Asteraceae. Can you see this? Can you see how these are all related, just like all of our cats are related? It works. It's how we study plants, by studying their relationships until we can get to a positive identification. Can you see how this unknown specimen is related to the sunflower and to the daisy and to the bidens? You see the familial characteristics that place it within that family? I'll tell you one of the secrets of that family. It's not one flower. Each one of these little things here is an individual flower. Each one of these little flowers sticking out its little black tongue. You see that? That's one of the things that holds this group, the Asteraceae, together. They present hundreds of tiny little flowers out to the pollinators with modified flowers around the edge, each one of these being an individual flower. That's one of the secrets that holds this family together. And here we have green eyes. So if we had this unknown specimen, we recognized it was an Asteraceae. We've eliminated all the things that it couldn't be. And then we can just study that one group, the Asteraceae, until we find, through various methods, the name of our unknown specimen. The individual little flowers, here we have a sunflower within the Asteraceae, and you can see those individual flowers. Each one of those individual flowers, once it's pollinated, ripens into a single fruit. So here we have the little yellow sunflower, and the fruit underneath is ripening up. There's one seed inside. So what we call sunflower seeds are actually little dry fruits with a seed inside. That we can go into in detail in advanced plant identification, which is a course that we teach next month, 12 hours over 3 Saturdays. The link will be in the chat on signing up. Then we really get into the details about some of these families and really how to drill down into it. So is everyone all right so far? Okay. Do you see in the background of this slide, what is that thing called? I think it's Cosmos or something. You can see how it might be related to the Asteraceae, a member of that family. All right, let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to some plant identification. The first elimination, after we've decided that our unknown is not a moss, not a fern, and not a conifer, we've got a flowering plant. Let's figure out, let's make our first major elimination of what our unknown could be. Flowering plants themselves, all those 300,000 species or however many, can be divided into 2 major groups. So we can eliminate everything that belongs to one group and focus on that other group. Flowering plants can be divided into a group of flowering plants called the Monocots and a group of flowering plants called the Eudicots. They're either one or the other. The Monocots are characterized by having parallel leaf veins. So the veins in their leaves run parallel to one another. Flower parts in multiples of 3, and their seeds, if you have access to them, are only made of 1 part. You can't break them into 2. Imagine a peanut seed that you can break very neatly into 2 parts. That would be a representative dicot or eudicot. Eudicots are that second group with branching leaf veins. Flower parts in 4s or 5s, and the seed parts in 2s, like our peanut. So here we have our representative monocot, and let's just count petals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, multiples of 3. If you were to get in here and count the stamens, there would be 6. You can even see the structure right here in the center of the flower that receives the pollen has 3 lobes. This is a lily. This is a drawing of a lily, and this is an accurate drawing of a monocot with its flower parts in 3s. On the other side, we have a hibiscus, a drawing of a hibiscus, and its flower parts are in 5s. 4s or 5s. We can count 1, 2, 3, 4. This is actually 5 petals, 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5. But even if it was 4, you could see. And the branching leaf veins. All right, we're going to focus in on that over and over again until I hope you've got it really clear. The main division of the flowering plants, monocots and eudicots. If you have access to a seed, that's great. 1 cotyledon, which gives the group its name, monocotyledon, versus 2 cotyledons, not a star in plant identification. It's just it just is. But for plant identification, these stars represent the characters that are most easily observed. The parallel leaf veins, like we have in a palm leaf, versus the branched or netted veining, like we have here in this maple leaf. The vascular bundles, that is kind of a microscopic thing that, again, isn't all that useful when you're in the field trying to identify something. But those flower parts in threes. So we have the 1, 2, 3, actual 3 flowers of the iris. And if you can imagine an iris leaf that just peels, maybe you can imagine this, but iris leaf veins are parallel to one each other, versus this thing, which looks like it might be Tibicina, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. If we could count the stamens, there would be 5 stamens, and so on. So multiples of 4 or 5. Monocot, dicot. Here's a lily, monocot, parallel leaf veins, flower parts in threes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 petals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stamens. The receptive central stigma is 3-lobed. There you have it. An iris, 3 flowers. Each one of these 3 flowers has flower parts in threes. And of course, iris has the parallel leaf veins. The parrot lily, 6 petals, 3 or 6 stamens, parallel leaf veins. You see where I'm going? Grass is a monocot. Grass is a flowering plant with parallel leaf veins, a blade of grass. Palms, we mentioned before, a flowering plant with those parallel leaf veins. And yes, flower parts in threes. So monocots, one of our major divisions of the flowering plants. Deciding which of these 2 groups we have, monocot or eudicot, is our first step in making a proper ID for a flowering plant. Here we have one of our star monocots out here at Brooker Creek Preserve. This is Catesby's lily. Its genus is Lilium. Its species is Lilium catesbii, which literally translates as Catesby's lily. And it ticks all the boxes of being a proper monocot with its 6 petals, 6 stamens. The receptive structure that receives the pollen is got 3 lobes. If you were to slice through the seed pod, it would be divided into 3 separate chambers. So everything about this is in threes with the parallel leaf veins. The lily family, the Liliaceae, includes several different genera. Familiar genera will include Lilium, lily, which we just saw. Fritillary, are y'all familiar with fritillary or fritillary as a flower, not as a butterfly? That's what's pictured in the center here. And of course, tulips. Tulips are a member of the lily family in the genus Tulipa, but in the family Liliaceae. Recognizing familial characteristics help us figure out what our unknown species might be. You don't have to memorize all these things. What does it take? Practice, getting familiar, and then recognizing these things in real life in your practice. So we have the lily family, including the genus Lilium, Tulipa, Fritillary, and the dog-toothed violet Erythronium. More monocots. Saw palmetto, Serenoa repens, Serenoa serrated, saw, the leaf petioles are toothed and will cut you to ribbons. Repens, which means the lying on its side saw palmetto. So Serenoa repens, the saw palmetto. Flower parts in threes, parallel leaf veins. Those parallel leaf veins are obvious in a palm frond. They actually split along those veins into the palm-shaped frond that many palms have. Saw palmetto flowers, being monocots, are going to be in multiples of what? 3. Let's count 3 petals. 1, 2, 3. 6 stamens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So on. Now, undoubtedly, inevitably, individual flowers can break during development, can just come out wrong. So generally speaking, when you're working with an unknown, you need to back up and get the trend for the entire plant. So it's very possible that we could walk up to a saw palmetto one time that produces hundreds, thousands of these tiny little white flowers. They're pollinated by flies and really, really small bees. There might be one that has 4 petals. There might be one that has 5 petals here and there, just by accident. But generally speaking, the trend is that the saw palmetto is going to produce these tiny little white flowers with 3 petals and 6 stamens. The cabbage palm, another palm, parallel leaf veins. You can see the leaves split along those veins. Flower parts and threes. Here is an inflorescence of cabbage palm flowers. Can you see how it's related to another palm? They produce very similar flowers because they're in the same family. You see how this works? It's like the kitty cats. They have this familial resemblance. So the palm family used to be called the palmae, which was much easier to remember. Now things are standardized. The palm family is referred to as the Ericaceae because of the areca palm. Areca, Ericaceae, areca palm, the coconut palm, the genus Cocos, the oil palm, genus Elaeus, and our cabbage palm in the genus Sable. More monocots. Can't get enough of monocots. Pineapple is a flowering plant in its own family. Why bring this one up? Because we have some native bromeliads. Here is a pineapple flowering with 1, 2, 3 petals. So flower parts are in 3s. Each one of these flowers is going to produce a nice little fat, juicy fruit. All those little fat, juicy fruits are connected to one another and forms that big conglomerate structure that's so yummy and juicy, the pineapple fruit, which is actually all the fruits of all these individual little flowers stuck together. But we have natives that are related. They're in the same family. Their flowers are put together the same way. The giant air plant, which you'll see growing as an epiphyte in the woods, especially up here at Brooker Creek Preserve. Tillandsia utriculata, the giant air plant. The Florida air plant, Tillandsia simulans, which means it looks like something else. The flowers are put together just like the pineapple with 3 petals, the ovary that's going to ripen its seeds, the leaves that are long and fibrous, but they're put together differently enough to separate them into a different genus altogether within the bromeliad family. The cardinal air plant, Tillandsia, another Tillandsia species, this one is fasciculata, with the characteristic fibrous linear leaves, the flower parts in 3s. These flowers concentrated in these bright red bracted areas. You can see perhaps the little purple flowers sticking out here and there, each one of those flowers ripening into a fruit. The pineapple family are the bromeliads, and the family, thankfully, is the Bromeliaceae. You can probably remember that. In the background of this slide, we have a member of the Bromeliaceae that you've probably never considered a flowering plant before, much less a bromeliad. In the background is Spanish moss. It's not my fault that it has that name. It's not a moss. It's not a moss. It's a flowering plant that has lost its roots and stems. All that's left are leaves and flowers. these have become so specialized that they have left, they've kind of become the black sheep of the family, if you will, and gone out on their own and kind of given up all these extra body parts in favor of just hanging from trees. But the way that their flowers are put together, their long fibrous leaves, and several other characteristics places Spanish moss in the Bromeliaceae. Okay? Pineapples, this house plant called Acma, Spanish moss, Guzmania, another one of the flashy bromeliads. These all, even though they might not be as easily recognized familial characteristics, these all hang together quite well in this one family, the Bromeliaceae, just like our cats with their morphology. Couple more monocots, the grasses. Flowering plants, yes. Lopsided Indian grass, Sorghastrum. Grasses have parallel leaf veins, and yes, they do have flower parts in threes. Foxtail grass, being a grass with those parallel leaf veins and flower parts in threes, this grass is put together differently than its cousin, the lopsided Indian grass, but foxtail grass, lopsided Indian grass, finger grass, which is kind of a roadside weed with its flowering stalks that kind of stick up like fingers, Eustaches, even sand spurs, yes, a grass, a flowering plant. These all have familial characteristics that place them into actually a rather large flowering plant group known as the Graminae, or the standardized name that they've been given, the Poaceae. Grasses have tiny little flowers, and they have flower parts in threes. Look at those three stamens. 1, 2, 3. That's just one flower. We've got the stamens, and we've got the pollen receptive structure. Grasses do not produce petals. They don't produce nectar because they're not attracting insect pollinators. Do you know what pollinates grass? You probably do. If you take a deep breath in through your nose, they use the wind to carry their pollen. They've foregone the assistance of insects and given up things to chance by broadcasting pollen into the air, produced on the stamens, drifts and lands on the receptive structures, and the one fruit develops with one giant seed inside. Here we have a branching spike of grass flowers. You can do the math, multiply that up. Each one of those is going to produce one seed. Hopefully one seed will germinate and keep the population stable. The grass family, the sea oats, Uniola, pampas grass, Cordaderia, wheat, very economically important grass, Triticum. Another economically important grass is Zea, or sweet corn, the Poaceae. So an unknown specimen, we see that it's got parallel leaf veins. It's got vanishingly small flowers that are obviously wind pollinated. We might be in the grass family, so we've eliminated everything else, and we can identify this one unknown species based on further characteristics once we know what family it's in. More monocots. I'm sure you've heard of orchids. This is the moth orchid, Phalaenopsis. We have some natives. The tooth petal false rain orchid, the world's worst common name. Habenaria, an orchid. It's an orchid because of its morphology, the way that the flowers are put together. Beaked ladies' tresses. This belongs in the orchid family. It's the genus, it's the species Saccoila lanceolata. The giant orchid in the genus, in the species Orthochilus ecrostatus. Parallel leaf veins, the flower parts are in threes. The flowers are put together in a very particular way, particular to this family of flowering plants, the orchid family. The butterfly orchid also, with its flowers, its morphology, matching those of its cousins, different enough to be in a different genus, but all together, all these genera together are representatives of this one family, the Orchidaceae. So going out into the field, you could recognize, okay, this is an orchid. Let's figure out which one it is. Now that might not be so easy. There are 28,000 different orchids. So if you want a lifetime career, go and identify unknown orchid species. Or choose this one particular family to concentrate on, to focus on. We have maybe 24 native orchids, maybe a dozen or so native orchids in Pinellas County. Study them first. Take that little subset and then figure out what makes them different to one another. Lily family, palm family, pineapple family, grass family, orchid family. Those are some representative families of monocots. Okay, it's not all of them, but it's some that you might recognize. Start thinking about, oh yeah, I already knew all that. I know a palm when I see one. Now I know that there's a reason that they're related to each other. Okay, monocots, parallel leaf veins. Okay, we've done the monocots. I'm going to get a drink of water. Everyone get a drink of water. And let's talk about the second group, the eudicots, with their netted leaf veins and flower parts in 4s and 5s. The eudicots, netted leaf veins. Look in the background. You can see the mid vein, and then you can see the side veins, and then they're all branched and netted. This is a rose, of course. Flower parts in 4s and 5s. This is a little what I call rock rose, a little native wildflower with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. For sample size, let's go a little bit bigger in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that seems to be the trend across this group of plants. Flower parts in 5s. Here we have a pair of yellow flowers with how many petals? 4. Are they the same thing? Do they look different enough? Right, but they both have 4 yellow petals, but they might not be the same thing. That's starting to get into real world plant identification, isn't it? But let's just keep it simple for now. Netted leaf veins of the coastal plain Lyonia, flower parts in 4s and 5s. Now standing back from this plant and looking at this weird urn-shaped flower, how are we going to tell if the flower parts are in 4s or 5s or 3s or anything? It takes magnification. Some flowers are vanishingly small, and they require a hand lens to really get a good look at some of the characters that are necessary for plant identification, like the number of petals, like the number of stamens. And luckily, we have a dear friend, John Lampkin, who can take a macro photograph of anything and it'll come out perfectly. And he managed to, here's my picture that's bad and blurry of the coastal plain Lyonia or Fetterbush. And here's what John got. And look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. They're all fused into a balloon. There's 5 petals, not 1, there's 5, but they're fused together. That's another character. So 5 petals fused into a balloon, inflated with a hand lens or with John's macro lens, we could count the number of stamens in there, and so on. Netted leaf veins, flower parts in 4s or 5s. What do you do if the flower is a tube, like it is in the morning glories? You can still back up a little bit and get a feel for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals, again, that are fused together. But we can see that even though the petals are fused, there are 5, not 3. The swamp rose, literally, Rosa palustris, literally means rose of the swamp. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many stamens? Well, a lot. Sometimes that'll do. Sometimes the number of stamens isn't as critical as other floral characteristics. A relative of the swamp rose is the blackberry. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many stamens? A whole bunch. Just like its cousin, a whole bunch. A familial characteristic of this group. The hog plum, Prunus umbellata, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals across this inflorescence. Many stamens, another relative of the rose and the blackberry. So those are all examples of the Rosaceae. Genus Rosa, genus strawberry, genus raspberry and blackberry, rosemary, blackberry in the same family, rubus, and apple in the genus Malus or Malus. Now, you can even count flower parts if the flower is long gone. Once an apple flower has been pollinated and the seeds inside have been, or the eggs inside the ovary have become seeds and are ripened and the fruit begins to ripen, the flower is long gone, but we can still count flower parts by slicing the fruit in half because the fruit is made of one part of the flower. That part of the flower is called an ovary, and the ovary becomes the fruit. And slicing through the ovary, as we do when we slice an apple in half, we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the flower parts are now reflected in the fruit. And we can count 5. And we can tell that an apple is in fact a eudicot. Our last family, a familiar family that we used as an example before. And here we have Coreopsis, which means it looks like a tick. The seeds apparently reminded someone of a tick, and it gave the whole genus the name Coreopsis. Leavenworthii means this is named after. This looks like a tick is named after Leavenworth. It happens to be our state wildflower. Along with it, the coastal plain honeycomb head, Balduina angustifolia. You can see those ray flowers and the tiny little disc flowers, you'll recall, characteristic of this family, the sunflower family. Here's an actual sunflower, swamp sunflower, Helianthus, which means sunflower. Like how they do that? Angustifolius means it has leaves like grass. And if you look closely, slightly blurry picture, but it does have long, narrow leaves. Are the leaf veins parallel? Say no. No. They're branched because we're eudicots. Eliot's aster, Symphotrichum eliotii. Again, you can see, hopefully, that this bears a familial resemblance to all the others in this family, the Asteraceae. Green eyes, this was our formerly unknown specimen with those ray flowers, yellow ray flowers, and then the tiny little disc flowers. But having all those tiny little flowers clustered very, very close to each other is one characteristic that holds this group of wildflowers together into what we know as the Asteraceae, including that genus Helianthus. Thistles belong in this family. And by extraction, artichokes are in the Asteraceae. We actually eat the unopened flower bud of a type of thistle. Leucanthemum are the daisies, the oxeye daisies, the wildflowers. And even dandelions are a member of the Asteraceae. So their inflorescences are put together. They are this composite of tiny little flowers all crowded onto a stage, if you will. Our next elimination from family, we've got to figure out, okay, now we know that our unknown is in the Asteraceae. We've got it. It has the familiar characteristics. You can do this. It's some kind of yellow daisy thing, but which one is it? Is it a coreopsis, a tick seed? Is it a helianthus, a sunflower? Is it a berlandiera, a green eyes, or is it a silphium? We need to look at some more characteristics to find out what makes a coreopsis and what makes a silphium. One of the things, thankfully we have resources to help us for, look at the size of these little leaf-like structures behind the inflorescence. They're big and spoon-shaped. That is one of the characteristics that would help us tell the difference between this compass plant and the green eyes. That might be one of the characters that we would need to study. And finally, the last elimination, once we have figured out all the things, all the characters that define a particular genus, it has to have this, and this, and we know it's a helianthus. Now, how do we tell the difference between one and the other? Well, these three examples of the same genus might be very easy to tell apart based on their kind of larger morphological characteristics. The fact that this species of helianthus, the swamp sunflower, with its narrow, rough leaves, makes it unique. And that is how, with an unknown group, we have an unknown specimen. We know what group it's in. We can figure out what genus it's in. And the one characteristic beyond all others, those long, narrow leaves that are rough like sandpaper, help us identify it to the proper species. Helianthus annua is the garden sunflower, where we get sunflower oil and sunflower seeds, which we learned are actually little hard fruits with a single seed inside. They complete their life cycle in 1 year, which is what gives them their name annua. That might be enough of a characteristic to help us determine that our unknown species is Helianthus annua, because it's obviously not here anymore. It came and went in a single year. And of course, Helianthus radula, which is one of our native sunflowers, it completely lacks the flowers clustered around the outside of this stage. They just don't even form. Only the tiny little disc flowers form. There, boom, we can tell that this species of Helianthus can only be one thing, Helianthus radula. All right, let's all take a breath. That's some heavy stuff. Contemplate little leucanthemum here. Contemplate its family, the Asteraceae. It's also mixed in with some members of the Poaceae, which we learned today are grasses, flowering plants, monocots. Grasses have flower parts in how many? Yes, 3. Parallel leaf veins. These are all characters. These are all bits of information that we are challenged with to make eliminations until we arrive at a proper identification. Here we go back to that one slide where I say things get real. Now we're out in the field, which is what scientists refer to as the outdoors, looking at plants that have come up on their own. And we have these 2 specimens. Their flowers are the same size, they're the same color, they have 4 petals, But there's something about the way that both of these plants grow, the rest of the story, that makes them clearly not the same species. Are they even closely related to each other? Well, they have what appear to be familial characteristics, at least at first glance, but looking closer, one of these plants is going to have leaves that are attached opposite to one another across the entire plant. The other is going to have leaves that are attached alternate to one another across the entire plant. And then we'll start to see some more differences. One of these plants is going to have all of the little leaves that form the flower bud before the flower even opens fused together into an urn-shaped tube, and the other isn't. So even though at first glance these seem like they might have familial similarities, looking at the sum of all the characters helps us realize that they actually belong in two separate families altogether. The sum of their characters place them in separate plant families. So that's when things get a little bit more difficult. That's why we have to collect as many characters as we can, even though some of those characters can be quite dodgy, small, requiring hand lens and so on in further study. Context clues are also very important. The habitat where the thing is found, the individual, the unknown plant. One of these plants is more likely found in uplands where the ground is dry. Another is found in wetlands. So one of these plants requires a saturated soil that's wet all the time. And you're not going to find it growing underneath a longleaf pine tree up in a sandhill situation. So again, knowing the names, the vocabulary, just like playing an instrument, you need to know the names of the chords. You need to know what a chord is, right? You need familiarity with reading music. All of this discipline requires the vocabulary just like any other discipline. And oftentimes it's the way that flowers are put together that help us eliminate what it can't be and get closer to what family it belongs to, then what genus it belongs to, and then finally what it actually is. What we have here is a longitudinal section through a flower. Flowers are all put together the same way, just different configurations. Flowers have these structures around the outside, these structures towards the center, this structure in the very center of the flower, often these structures that help attract the pollinator to these things. And all of these parts have to have names because they can all have particular characteristics. The anther is where the pollen is produced. The filament is that structure that holds the anther up into the air. Now the anther could have a shape, a size, a color. The filament could have a length, or you count up the number of filaments. Together, these are referred to as the stamen. The sepal is that little seed leaf, that little leaf that forms the bud before the flower even opens. That could have a character. It could have a color. It could have a texture. It could be covered in dots. It could be covered in hairs. So the sepal questions might come up when you're working with a field guide that's helping you identify an unknown species, asking the description of the sepals. Of course, the petals are the first thing we're going to see when we're approaching flowering plants that produce petals. Remember, the grasses don't even produce petals, so we have to go with the other vocabulary unique to grass identification. Anyway, all these other words, pistil, style, ovary, and so on, the ovule within the ovary. The ovules can be arranged in a particular way. The ovary can sit up above all the other flower parts or down below all the other flower parts. Anyway, so flowers have a basic construction, but then the configuration of all these parts are ultimately what separate groups of plants into their discrete families. I'm keeping you a little bit late. What's your favorite book? I get asked. I don't have one. I have a lot. I have a bookshelf. I have some that I refer to more often than not. Plant identification term. I don't make any money off of any of these at all. But these are ones that we tend to have the most dog ears in. Plant identification terminology. Because this discipline is based on a vocabulary that is not unique to botany or plant identification. Some words exist across all the life sciences, but that illustrated glossary of terminology is very, very useful when you are using another one of these books, like the Guide to the Vascular Plants of Florida. So this is everything except the ferns. The vascular plants, remember the ones that have the plumbing, the ferns, the conifers, and the flowering plants, those are all going to be identified in this guide, but you're going to be asked questions. This is like choose your ending, the Guide to the Vascular Plants. You have to make choices. Is it a monocot or a dicot? If it's a dicot, go to page 300. Literally, that's how these things are written. And then on page 300, it begins to ask you more questions. Is the ovary shaped like a U or is the ovary shaped like a W? If it's shaped like a U, go to page 500 and so on. That's how these guides work, these keys work. These two books in the center upper, and also this one over here on the side, the Central Florida Wildflowers and Florida Wildflowers. These are organized by flower color. Now, how much easier can that get? You have our little yellow job that we had before, the 2. You go to the yellow flower section and you look for the ones with 4 petals, and then you start reading the description, and that description is going to discuss the configuration of other parts of the plant and the location where it's growing. It's going to identify the family that that plant is in. So even if the very species isn't in one of these 2 books, you could get very close. You could probably get down to the genus, that you know it's some type of Ludwigia, and that could be good enough. So the Central Florida Wildflowers, of course, these books aren't complete, but they're very thorough. The photography in this Falcon Guide by Roger Hammer is exquisite. The only thing I can say is that sometimes they're too close. The close-ups are too close, and it's not really something that you can see with your eye. But if you do have that hand lens, that could help. Taylor is a favorite of native plant enthusiasts. Again, the showier of the wildflowers. Here we have a book that just deals with the ferns in Florida, so that you've made all the other eliminations. Let's just focus on identifying this particular unknown species of fern. If you were daring to join us for advanced plant identification, which starts next Saturday, the 10th, that class, we provide you with this book, How to Identify Plants. Registration ends tomorrow. We will have enough time to send you your class materials, including this book, which is basically what we've gone over today, how you approach the subject, how you deconstruct your unknown specimen to collect the data that ultimately you will use to take your specimen through the choose your ending, end up with your specimen key. Also, just learning the terminology, learning the practice, learning the discipline makes using these false keys, these color-coded wildflower guides, it makes it better. It makes it more accurate. It makes you able to say, it looks very much like that picture, but I know for a fact it can't possibly be because I learned X, Y, or Z, and so on. Isn't there just an app? Do we have to really go through all those words and all that? Well, you kind of can. Obviously saving this to the end, because it's not, ultimately, if you really, really want to do this, you really want to get into it, you really want to study it properly, really want it to be kind of secondhand. But if you're just kind of curious about this one thing and you want to fool around with an app on your phone, there is one that we recommend above all the others, and we've tested them all out, and I know you're going to email me and say, I had really good luck with Google Lens. It told me exactly what I wanted or what it was. Or anyway, there are certainly a lot of choices, but we recommend the one free app called iNaturalist. It is citizen science. It is giving you the ability to upload a photograph of an unknown specimen, and its artificial intelligence runs that picture through all the other pictures that have been uploaded to iNaturalist, tries to find a match, does a very good job, and then within seconds offers you a few suggestions. Those suggestions you can then further, as a human, make some decisions about. Well, it can't be this particular thing because I'm on the wrong continent, for one thing. But it's going to give you a collection of choices. The good part is you contribute to that artificial intelligence, making it even better. So each observation you make helps the AI get better. But in iNaturalist, it doesn't end there. You upload your observation, you assign a name to it, either based on your own ideas or the suggestions that the application makes. But it takes a human, it takes two humans to then look at your observation, that photograph that you uploaded, and agree or disagree. Agree why, disagree why. And it can get really hot on iNaturalist with people disagreeing with one another, but that's what makes it good. Because human beings are going back and forth and arguing about why it must be this and not this. So yes, it can be done. We recommend contributing to this project, iNaturalist. Some of the other identification applications are basically just kind of weird, sneaky backdoors to try and advertise stuff to you. You might take a picture of a plant and it's going to try and sell you potting soil or something weird like that. So just bear that in mind. iNaturalist is not that sort of thing. So my voice is giving out. We've come to the end of our hour. I really appreciate so many of you tuning in today, sitting in front of a screen like we've all done for the past year. I'd like now to have a look at the Q&A. If you do have any questions, complaints can maybe be saved for the email. And while I'm taking a drink of water and opening the questions, Julia's going to launch a really quick poll. And we appreciate you just filling in the blanks right quick. It's a multiple choice, and you can just answer these questions really quickly. I'm going to mute myself and get a quick drink of water. And as soon as we've got about 75% chimed in, we'll start back up. All right. First question in the Q&A. The question that the asters seem to have more than 4 or 5 petals. We were talking about the asters, the composites being in the Asteraceae, and it looks like they've got all those extra petals around the outside. Well, if you'll recall, an aster is not one flower. That's what gives that family its name, the Compositae. That disc has individual flowers all crowded together on it. Each one of those individual flowers has 5 petals. All the stuff around the outside of an aster, those are 5 fused petals stretched out into a long strap. So each one of those petals around the outside of an aster flower or sunflower or the compass plant, those are individual flowers, not individual petals. That blows your mind. I understand. It's something that blows a lot of people's mind about the sunflower group, that when you look at a sunflower, that's not one flower. That's hundreds of tiny little flowers, each one of those individual little flowers having 5 miniature petals. Someone is hiking with a friend who has an app, takes a picture of the flower. The app tells her what the plant is. I have had that experience with this app, the iNaturalist. You take the picture, you upload it, it runs it through its AI, and then you hit suggestions, and it gives you its best guess. And then you take that a little bit further, and you can go with the very first thing that it comes up with, which it very often is, but you need to make sure that it's in the right place. You know, you're in the right continent, you're in the right season, you're in the right hemisphere, and all these things. Eventually, you will get a positive ID with that. All right, well, the questions are not coming in hard and fast. Looks like it's time for a nice walk outdoors. Hopefully, you have gained a little less fear of plant identification. We do hope that if there is anyone who's interested in pursuing our advanced plant identification, that you do sign up today. Registration closes tomorrow. We need to get all the materials sent out. But otherwise, we have a pretty full class. There's a few spaces left. We'd love to see you there. But otherwise, keep tuning in. Join us on Wednesday afternoons at 2 o'clock. Keep track of us at the Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center website, or follow us, the Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center, on Facebook. Otherwise, my email is up. Drop me a line. Questions, comments, complaints, all are welcome. Otherwise, hopefully, we will see you another Wednesday afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great afternoon. Goodbye.